The silence in the Havenwood, Colorado Territorial Hall was heavier than the August heat pressing on the clapboard walls. It was the absolute, airless quiet of 100 people holding their breath, the sound of a woman being erased. Her name was May. She was 40 years old, a widow twice over, once by the fever that took her husband, a railroad laborer, and once by the law that took his meager possessions, leaving her with nothing but the clothes she wore. Now, Mr. Barlow, the owner of the general store and the closest thing Havenwood had to a mayor, stood on the raised platform, clearing his throat. "As you all know," Barlow began, his voice oiled with false charity, "the territorial statutes are clear. An unattached person of foreign extraction cannot hold a claim or residency without a sponsor. Mrs. Lee has no family, no means." He gestured toward May, who stood near the wall, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at a spot on the floorboards, a dark knot in the wood, focusing all her will on that single point. "It would be an act of Christian kindness," Barlow continued, "for a man in this community to take her on, as a wife, of course, to give her a home. She is seasoned, but a hard worker, I am told." The silence returned, thick with judgment. Men shifted in their seats. Wives shot sharp glances at their husbands. 40 was old, and she was Chinese. In Havenwood, Colorado, in 1878, that made her less than a ghost. She was a burden to be disposed of. The seconds stretched into a minute, each one a small hammer blow against May's composure. Barlow's smile tightened. This public humiliation was precisely the point. It was a warning to the other Chinese laborers who worked the silver claims outside of town. You are tolerated, not welcome. You are temporary. "No one?" Barlow asked, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. "Not one man willing to offer this poor woman a roof?" He was about to bang his gavel, to declare the matter settled and her fate sealed, likely a wagon ride to the next territory with a note pinned to her dress, when a voice cut through the heat from the back of the hall. "I will." The voice was low and steady, carrying the quiet authority of disuse. It did not sound like it belonged to the town. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, framed by the blinding afternoon sun, was a man built of leather and granite. He was tall, with a beard that was more iron gray than black, and his eyes, even from across the room, were a pale, startling blue. He wore buckskins, not denim or wool, and carried the scent of pine and cold stone. It was Silas Blackwood, the mountain man, a man who came to town twice a year for salt, flour, and steel traps, paid in raw silver, and spoke to no one. The town whispered he was the richest man in the territory, his mountain riddled with veins of pure ore. They also whispered he was half wild, more animal than man. Barlow's jaw tightened. This was not part of his plan. "Blackwood," he said, his voice losing its charitable tone, "this is a matter for the community." "I'm part of this community," Silas said, his voice unchanged. He took a step into the room, and the crowd parted for him as if he were a wolf. "I have a registered claim. I pay my taxes. I'll take her." He didn't look at Barlow. His pale eyes found May's. For the first time she looked up from the floorboards. She saw no pity in his face. She saw no desire. She saw something far stranger, a kind of calm assessment, as if he were judging the grain of a piece of wood. Barlow sputtered. "You can't just... There are procedures." "A marriage contract." "Draw it up," Silas said, his gaze still on May. "I'll pay the filing fee." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and dropped 3 heavy silver dollars onto the clerk's table. They rang against the wood, a sound as final as a nail being driven into a coffin. Or a new house. May wasn't sure which. The town watched, stunned into submission. Silas Blackwood, the hermit, the ghost of the high peaks, had just claimed the unwanted Chinese widow, and no one, not even a man as powerful as Barlow, was brave enough to ask him why. The walk from the town hall to the wagon was the longest of May's life. Silas walked a pace ahead of her, not offering a hand, but clearing a path through the gawking townsfolk with his mere presence. Barlow caught up to them just as Silas was helping May onto the seat of a sturdy freight wagon, its bed already loaded with sacks of flour, salt, and crates of tinned goods. "Blackwood, a word," Barlow said, his face a mask of concern. He placed a hand on the wagon wheel, stopping it from moving. "Are you certain about this? You don't know what you're getting into." Silas looked down at Barlow's hand, then at his face. "I know exactly what I'm getting," he said. "A wife, as sanctioned by you and the good people of this town." "But think of your reputation," Barlow pressed, lowering his voice. "A man like you. People look up to you, even if you keep to yourself. This is unseemly." "My reputation is my business," Silas stated, his voice flat. He picked up the reins. "Take your hand off my wagon, Barlow." The request was spoken quietly, but it carried the chilling promise of a rock slide. Barlow, for all his bluster, was a merchant, not a fighter. He snatched his hand back as if the wood were hot. He gave May a look of pure contempt, then turned his attention back to Silas. "You're making a mistake. There are things about this mountain you don't understand, things that belong to the town, to its future." "The mountain and I understand each other just fine," Silas said. He slapped the reins, and the two heavy mules lurched forward. The wagon rolled out of Havenwood, leaving Barlow standing in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. The trail up the mountain was less a road and more a suggestion. It clung to the side of the rock, winding through stands of aspen and dark pine. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the jingle of the harness, and the steady plod of the mules. May sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the space between the mules' ears. She was a passenger in her own life, a piece of cargo being transported from one precarious situation to another. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice startling in the quiet. "Are you hungry?" May shook her head. "No, thank you." "There's jerky in that sack," he said, nodding toward a canvas bag at her feet, "and a canteen of water." His tone was practical, not kind. It was the way a man might speak to a hired hand. May found it strangely comforting. It was a language she understood better than pity. She drank a little water, the metal of the canteen cool against her lips. The higher they climbed, the more the air changed. The thick, dusty heat of the valley gave way to a crisp coolness scented with pine sap and damp earth. The sky opened up, a vast, unforgiving blue. They were leaving the world of men behind. The crisis came without warning. They were navigating a narrow stretch of trail that cut across a dry wash when the sky, clear moments before, turned a bruised purple. A wind whipped down the canyon, carrying the smell of rain. Silas pulled the mules to a halt, his head cocked, listening. "Get down," he said, his voice sharp. "Now!" May didn't question him. She scrambled from the wagon seat just as the first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall. Silas was already unhitching the mules, his movements economical and swift. "What is it?" she asked, shouting over the rising wind. "Flash flood," he yelled back, shoving a mule's rump to get it moving toward higher ground. "This wash will be a river in 5 minutes." He was right. The rain came down not in drops, but in a solid sheet. The dry, cracked earth of the wash darkened instantly, and a low rumble echoed from up the canyon. It grew to a roar, the sound of 1,000 boulders being rolled downhill. A wall of churning brown water, filled with branches and debris, appeared at the bend. The wagon stood directly in its path. It held all his supplies for the winter. It held everything. Silas grabbed a coil of rope from the wagon bed. "Stay here," he ordered May, pointing to a cluster of rocks well above the trail. But May was looking at the lead mule, which had pulled free and was now panicking, its eyes wide with terror as it tried to scramble back toward the doomed wagon. Therefore, instead of running for safety, May moved toward the animal. She spoke to it in a low, calm voice, using the Mandarin phrases she had used to soothe frightened chickens and stray dogs. The words didn't matter. The tone did. The mule stopped its panicked bucking, its ears twitching toward her. Silas saw what she was doing. He had the second mule secured, but had no time for the first. The water was coming. He had to make a choice, the animal or the supplies. But May was already there, her small hand on the mule's bridle, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. She was not pulling it. She was simply standing with it, a point of stillness in the chaos. The first wave of water hit the wagon, spinning it sideways with a groan of tortured wood. Silas threw the rope, its end weighted, toward a thick pine on the other side of the wash. It caught. He began hauling on it, his boots sinking into the mud, trying to anchor the wagon before it was swept away completely. The water was at his knees, then his waist, its force immense. He was losing ground. Then May was beside him, her hands on the rope just behind his. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, but her grip was firm. She added her weight, her strength to his. Together they leaned back, the rope biting into their palms. The community of Havenwood had judged her as a fragile, useless burden, but here, in the heart of the storm, she was pulling her weight and more. The wagon held. The main force of the flood passed, leaving a churning, waist-deep river behind. Panting, soaked, and shivering, they stood in the aftermath. The wagon was battered but intact. The mules were safe. Silas looked at May, really looked at her, for the first time since the town hall. He saw not a victim, but a survivor. A flicker of something, respect, surprise, showed in his pale eyes. "You should have gone for the rocks," he said, his voice rough with exertion. "The mule would have been lost," she replied simply, looking at the animal, which now stood calmly on higher ground. "And your rope needed another pair of hands." He just nodded, a short, sharp gesture. The surface conflict with the storm was over. But as they stood there in the wreckage of the trail, Silas looked back down the mountain toward the distant lights of Havenwood that would soon be visible in the twilight. He knew Barlow. He knew the man's greed, and he knew that a flash flood was the least of their troubles. They reached Silas's homestead after dark, the moon a sliver of bone in the black sky. The cabin was not the rough-hewn hovel May had expected. It was made of thick, perfectly fitted logs, with a stone chimney that rose straight and true. A porch ran the length of the front, and in the faint moonlight she could see it was clean swept. This was a place built with care, a home, not a temporary shelter. Inside, a fire was already laid in the hearth. Silas lit it with a single match, and the room filled with a warm, dancing light. There was one large room, with a sturdy table and 2 chairs, shelves filled with books and preserved goods in glass jars, and a bed in the corner, covered with a thick bearskin. A smaller room was partitioned off at the back. "That room is yours," Silas said, gesturing with the poker. "There's a cot and some blankets. I'll bring in your things." He had purchased a small trunk for her at the general store, filled with 2 simple dresses, underthings, and a pair of sturdy boots, a transaction conducted with the same impersonal efficiency as his purchase of flour. He'd paid Barlow's exorbitant prices without a word. While he unloaded the wagon, May looked around the main room. It was a man's space, but it was orderly. Tools were hung on the walls, each in its place. The books surprised her. There was Shakespeare, a Bible, and several volumes on geology and engineering. This was not the home of an ignorant wild man. It was the home of someone who had chosen solitude, not had it thrust upon him. When Silas came back inside, he placed her trunk at the foot of the cot in the small room. He didn't linger. He went to the hearth and began preparing a meal, salt pork, beans, and coffee. They ate in silence at the big table. The silence was different now. It wasn't the hostile quiet of the town hall or the tense quiet of the wagon ride. It was the companionable silence of two people who had weathered a storm together and were too tired for unnecessary words. After they ate, Silas took 2 tin cups of coffee out to the porch. He handed one to her and leaned against a post, looking out at the vast darkness where the mountains slept. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice low. May waited, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. "This isn't about needing a wife," he began, staring out into the night. "My wife, Sarah, she died of lung fever 5 years ago. I have no intention of replacing her." He paused, and May thought of the jars on the shelves, the neat stitching on a blanket draped over a chair, a woman's touch lingering like a ghost. "This is about the land," he continued, "this homestead. The claim is in my name, but it was originally filed under the Railroad Act. Barlow has found a lawyer in Denver. They're using a loophole in the territorial charter. They claim that since the railroad spur it was attached to was never completed, the original grant is invalid. They're trying to have the whole section declared unincorporated land, open for new claims." "And Barlow would be the first to file," May said quietly. It was not a question. Silas nodded, his profile grim in the moonlight. "He wants the silver. He thinks this whole mountain is one big vein. He might be right. But Sarah and I, this was our place. I buried her up there." He gestured with his chin toward a rise behind the cabin. "I won't let him have it." He turned to look at her, his pale eyes searching her face. "Under territorial law, a single man's claim, especially one under legal dispute, is vulnerable. But a family homestead, held by a husband and wife, has protections. More protections than even Barlow's lawyers can easily undo. As a widow, you have certain established legal rights that, when joined with mine through marriage, make our claim nearly unbreakable. I didn't save you from Barlow in that hall, Mrs. Lee. I recruited you." It was a confession, blunt and unadorned. He was not her savior. He was her employer. The marriage was a business contract. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he carefully extracted a folded piece of paper, its edges soft and frayed. It was a letter. "This was the last letter Sarah wrote to her sister," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "I keep it with the deed, the original deed." He handed it to May. The paper felt fragile in her hands. She didn't read the letter. She looked at the official deed folded around it. The ink faded, with the name Sarah Blackwood written in a clear, strong hand. This was the object of his fight. It wasn't just land or silver. It was a memory. It was the last piece of a life he had lost. "Why tell me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You have the marriage contract. I am your wife by law." "Because a piece of paper won't hold up when Barlow comes," Silas said. "And he will come. I needed a partner, not a servant. You needed to know what you were signing up for. You showed me today, in the flood, that you're not one to run. I'm asking you to stand with me, as an equal." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Equal. No one had ever used that word in relation to her before. Her father, her first husband, the foreman on the railroad, the people of Havenwood, they had all seen her as something to be managed, protected, or disposed of. Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Not one horse, but several, moving with purpose. Silas was on his feet in an instant, moving inside the cabin. He didn't reach for a rifle. He picked up a lantern. "Stay inside," he said, his voice cold iron once more. He stepped out onto the porch as 3 riders came into the clearing. It was Barlow, flanked by 2 hard-faced men May had never seen before. They were not townsfolk. "Blackwood," Barlow called out, his voice falsely jovial. He swung down from his horse. "Just paying a social call on the newlyweds." "It's the middle of the night, Barlow," Silas said, his body blocking the doorway. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows. "I have a legal notice," Barlow said, pulling a document from his coat. "From the territorial circuit judge. It's an injunction. Orders you to vacate this claim pending a title hearing in Denver." He held it out. "This land is no longer yours." One of Barlow's men unstrapped the leather thong from his holstered pistol. "The judge doesn't have jurisdiction over a federal homestead claim," Silas said calmly. "That's a matter for the U.S. Marshals." "The claim's validity is what's in question," Barlow sneered. "And until the marshal gets here, which could be weeks, the judge's order stands. Now, you and your bride are trespassing." May had been watching from the crack in the door. She saw the seal on the document. She had been a scribe for a merchant in her village in China. She knew paper, she knew ink, she knew the look of an official seal. This one was wrong. The wax was too new, the impression too shallow. This was her choice. She could stay hidden, let the men handle it, or she could step onto the porch. She thought of the silence in the town hall, the feeling of being erased. She thought of Silas's word, partner. She opened the door and stepped out, moving to stand beside Silas in the lantern light. "Mr. Barlow?" she said, her voice clear and steady. The men all looked at her, surprised. "May I see that document?" Barlow smirked. "I don't think you'd understand it." "I can read English," May said, "and I know a fraudulent seal when I see one." The smirk vanished from Barlow's face. His eyes narrowed. "You'd best get back inside, woman." "That injunction," May continued, her gaze unwavering, "is dated for tomorrow, August 14th, 1878, but it is still August 13th. You are attempting to enforce a legal order before it is valid, which is a crime." Silas glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had missed it. Barlow snatched the paper back, his face turning red. He had been so eager, he had overplayed his hand. "It's a clerical error," he snarled. "Perhaps the U.S. Marshal will see it that way," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Or perhaps he'll see it as fraud, backed by armed threat. I wonder what the penalty for that is." Barlow was trapped. His legal authority, flimsy as it was, had just been publicly shredded by the woman he'd tried to humiliate. His hired men looked at him, their confidence wavering. They were paid to enforce the law, not to be on the wrong side of it. "This isn't over, Blackwood," Barlow spat, climbing back onto his horse. "No, it's not," Silas agreed. "But for tonight, you'll get off my land." The 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode back down the mountain, swallowed by the darkness. May stood on the porch, the cold night air on her face, listening until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. She had made her choice. She had cost herself any chance of a life in town, but she had found her footing on this mountain. She had stood. By the following spring, the mountain had come alive. The snow had receded to the highest peaks, and the meadows were flush with green grass and wildflowers. The legal challenge from Barlow had evaporated. Silas had taken May's discovery of the post-dated injunction and sent a carefully worded telegram to the U.S. Marshal in Denver. An inquiry was opened. Barlow's influence, built on a foundation of bullying and bad credit, crumbled under official scrutiny. He was not arrested, but his power in Havenwood was broken. The partnership between Silas and May had settled into a quiet, productive rhythm. They had discovered a series of sheltered, high-altitude meadows where wild ginseng grew in abundance. May, who knew the plant from her homeland, showed Silas how to properly harvest and dry the roots. That spring they packed 3 heavy crates with the valuable cargo. Instead of selling it to Barlow's successor at the general store, Silas freighted it all the way to Denver himself, securing a contract with an apothecary that paid them 10 times what they would have made in Havenwood. Their first sale brought in over $200 in gold coin, a small fortune that secured their independence. With that money, they filed a new ironclad deed at the territorial office. It was a joint homestead claim, registered under the names Silas Blackwood and May Blackwood. Her name, written in clear, precise letters next to his, was now etched into the legal foundation of the territory. She was no longer a ghost. She was a landowner. The town of Havenwood began to see them differently. A few families who had also been squeezed by Barlow's predatory lending started making the trek up the mountain to trade. They brought chickens and cloth for May and sacks of grain for the mules, trading them for dried herbs and the strong, well-made tools Silas forged in his small smithy. They never spoke of the meeting in the town hall. It was a silent apology, an acknowledgment that they had been wrong. Acceptance wasn't a grand gesture. It was a slow, quiet path being worn to their door. One evening in late summer, a year after she had first arrived, May was sitting on the porch, mending one of Silas's shirts. Silas was at the far end of the porch, cleaning a rifle, the setting sun glinting off the oiled steel. A comfortable silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of insects and the sigh of the wind in the pines. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of fullness. He finished his work and came to sit in the chair beside her. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched the last rays of light paint the peaks in shades of orange and purple. "I never thank you," he said finally, his voice soft. May looked up from her sewing. "For what?" "For standing with me, for seeing the date on that paper. You saved this place." "You gave me a place to stand," she replied, folding the mended shirt. She looked out at the vast expanse of mountains, the land that was now hers as much as it was his. The silence in the town hall had been meant to erase her, to make her nothing, but it had failed. It had, in the end, given her everything. Belonging, she had learned, wasn't something a crowd could give you or take away. It was a thing you built, log by log, day by day, with your own 2 hands. And if you were lucky, you found someone to build it with, someone who saw the strength the rest of the world had overlooked.